3:10 a.m., August 21st, 1942. The narrow sand spit at Alligator Creek, Guadalcanal. About 200 Japanese soldiers charge across the moonlit beach toward Marine positions. In the darkness, American machine gunners track the approaching enemy through their sights. 20 yard, 15 yards, 10 yard. Close enough to see faces. Close enough to hear breathing. Close enough for the Japanese to throw grenades. Every instinct screams to open fire. Every manual says, engage at maximum range. Every veteran knows you never let the enemy get this close. But tonight, the Marines hold their fire. Tonight, they're breaking every rule of defensive warfare because Major General Harrison has turned this battle into a mathematics problem. Pre-registered artillery coordinates, interlocking fields of fire, and 37mm canister rounds, each packed with 122 steel balls waiting in the barrels like giant shotgun shells. The Japanese believe they're about to overrun another American position through superior spirit and night tactics. They have no idea they're walking into the most precisely engineered killing field in Marine Corps history. Sometimes letting your enemy get too close isn't a mistake, it's a trap. Colonel Takeshi Yamada stood on the deck of the destroyer Kagero as it cut through the black waters toward Guadalcanal, his mind consumed by what Japanese commanders had begun calling victory fever. The feeling had swept through the Imperial Army like wildfire since Pearl Harbor, an intoxicating certainty that American forces would crumble under determined assault, just as Chinese troops had broken across a dozen battlefields. Yamada carried with him the weight of canceled glory. His regiment had been designated for the capture of Midway, a prize that would have restored Japan's momentum in the Pacific. Instead, that operation had been scrubbed, leaving his men hungry for the kind of spectacular victory that would prove Japanese superiority once and for all. The intelligence reports had been encouraging. Aerial reconnaissance on August 12 showed little movement around the American perimeter at Henderson Field. When Yamada's advance elements landed near Taiyu Point on August 18, 25 mi east of the Marine positions, his radio operators reported back with confidence. No enemy contact, proceeding as planned. Higher headquarters had estimated American strength on Guadalcanal at perhaps 3,000 men, scattered and demoralized after their hasty landing. The math seemed simple. Yamada commanded 917 elite troops from the 28th Infantry Regiment. A swift night attack would overwhelm whatever token force the Americans had left to guard their precious airfield. What Yamada could not know as his men began their march along the coastal road toward Henderson Field was that Major General Douglas Harrison commanded nearly 11,000 Marines on the island. More critically, Harrison had spent the past 2 weeks transforming American defensive doctrine in ways that would have seemed impossible to officers trained in traditional Marine tactics. Where Marine Corps manuals emphasized aggressive assault and rapid maneuver, Harrison was implementing something revolutionary: defensive warfare as precision engineering. The transformation had begun with terrain analysis. Harrison studied the approaches to Henderson Field with the methodical eye of a civil engineer rather than a conventional military commander. The jungle terrain naturally funneled any eastern approach toward a single crossing point, the mouth of Alligator Creek, where a narrow sand spit provided the only practical ford at low tide. To the north, the ocean offered no concealment. To the south, dense jungle made large unit movement nearly impossible. Any serious attack from the east would have to come across that sand spit. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Morgan, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, had initially struggled with Harrison's defensive concept. Marine doctrine emphasized fire and maneuver, aggressive patrolling, meeting the enemy as far forward as possible. But Harrison's plan called for something that felt almost passive, allowing the enemy to approach within grenade range before opening fire. The psychological pressure on individual Marines would be enormous. Every instinct would scream to engage targets at maximum effective range, not to wait until Japanese soldiers were close enough to see their faces. Yet, as Morgan walked the defensive positions day after day, checking fields of fire and weapon placement, the geometric precision of Harrison's concept became clear. This was not passive defense. It was mathematical warfare. Water-cooled M197A1 Browning machine guns positioned with interlocking sectors of fire. Each crew trained to hold their sector, while neighboring guns covered the gaps. Pre-registered mortar concentrations and artillery fires from the 11th Marines with coordinates measured by daylight, so crews could dial in accurate fires in complete darkness. And most critically, 37mm M3 anti-tank guns loaded with M2 canister rounds. Each shell packed with 122 steel balls that would turn the narrow sand spit into a killing funnel. The discipline required was unprecedented. Marine machine gunners were accustomed to engaging targets at 400 to 600 yards when possible. Harrison's plan called for holding fire until Japanese forces were within 30 yards, close enough that individual enemy soldiers could throw grenades into Marine positions, close enough that the psychological pressure would test every man's nerve. But at that range, the 37mm canister rounds would function like enormous shotgun blasts, each shell capable of cutting down multiple attackers simultaneously. Private First Class William Bennett Manning, one of the water-cooled Brownings along the creek line, had spent the previous days trying to reconcile this new doctrine with everything he had been taught about Marine warfare. The M1917A1 could sustain cyclic rates of 450 to 600 rounds per minute, its water jacket preventing the barrel overheating that plagued air-cooled weapons during extended firefights. But firing at such close range meant accepting that some enemy soldiers would inevitably reach Marine positions before being cut down. The plan required absolute trust in the geometric precision of overlapping fires and the stopping power of canister rounds. Company G of the 1st Marines had been positioned as the mobile reserve, ready to counterattack any Japanese breakthrough before it could be consolidated. This was perhaps the most psychologically difficult role in Harrison's defensive scheme. While other Marines would at least have the satisfaction of firing their weapons, Company G would have to wait in reserve positions, trusting that the killing zone would function as designed, ready to launch immediate counterattacks if any Japanese forces managed to breach the line. As August 20th turned into August 21st, intelligence reports from coast watchers confirmed that a significant Japanese force was moving west along the coastal road. The Marines, settling into their positions along Alligator Creek, could not know they were about to participate in a tactical experiment that would reshape American defensive doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. They knew only that their commanding general had ordered them to let the enemy get close, closer than any Marine manual had ever contemplated, and trust in mathematics over instinct. The terrain itself dictated the geometry of death. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan had spent countless hours studying the ground where Alligator Creek met the sea, understanding that successful defensive engineering began with reading the landscape like a blueprint. The creek formed a natural barrier running roughly north-south before bending eastward to empty into the ocean. On the western bank, where the Marines had positioned their main line of resistance, the ground rose slightly, providing clear observation and fields of fire across the narrow sand spit that served as the only practical crossing point at low tide. To the north, the open ocean offered no concealment for attacking forces. To the south, dense jungle growth created a nearly impenetrable barrier to large unit movement. Any serious assault from the east would be channeled into a killing funnel less than 50 yards wide. Morgan had positioned his machine guns with surgical precision, each M1907A1 Browning sighted to cover specific sectors while overlapping with neighboring weapons to eliminate dead space. The water-cooled barrels could sustain the prolonged firing that this defensive concept demanded. Unlike the air-cooled weapons that would overheat during extended engagements, each gun crew had spent days measuring ranges to key terrain features, marking their aiming stakes for predetermined target reference points. At night, when visual identification became impossible, the machine gunners could traverse their weapons to pre-registered positions and deliver accurate fires based purely on mathematical calculations rather than visual confirmation. The artillery component of Harrison's defensive scheme represented perhaps the most sophisticated fire planning the Marine Corps had ever attempted in combat. Forward observers from the 11th Marines had pre-registered concentration points on the eastern bank of Alligator Creek, measuring precise distances and compass bearings during daylight hours. These coordinates were then plotted on firing charts, allowing artillery crews positioned miles behind the front lines to deliver accurate fires in complete darkness. The system transformed night artillery from guesswork into precision engineering. When observers called for fires on pre-registered concentrations, gun crews could simply dial in the predetermined settings and fire, confident their rounds would impact exactly where needed. The 37mm anti-tank guns represented the most innovative element of the defensive plan. Designed primarily to engage enemy armor, these weapons were being employed in an infantry support role that exploited their unique capabilities. Each M3 gun was loaded with M2 canister rounds containing 122 steel balls. When fired, these rounds functioned like enormous shotgun shells, creating a cone of destruction that could cut down multiple attackers simultaneously. At ranges of 20 to 30 yards, the canister rounds would achieve maximum effectiveness, with individual steel balls maintaining lethal velocity while spreading to cover the entire width of the sand spit crossing point. The psychological demands of this defensive system exceeded anything Marine training had prepared the men to handle. Private First Class Bennett and his machine gun crew had practiced the techniques repeatedly, but the reality of allowing armed enemy soldiers to approach within hand grenade range challenged every survival instinct. The M19107A1 could engage targets effectively at ranges of 800 to 1,000 yards under ideal conditions. Waiting until Japanese forces closed to within 30 yards meant accepting that some attackers would inevitably reach positions where they could throw grenades or even attempt to overrun individual fighting positions before being cut down. Fire discipline became the critical factor that would determine success or failure. Each weapon system had been assigned specific responsibilities within the overall defensive scheme. The 37mm guns would engage only when Japanese forces reached the predetermined kill zone on the sand spit. Machine guns would hold their fire until the canister rounds had been expended, then open up with interlocking fires to cut down any survivors attempting to continue the assault. Artillery concentrations would target the eastern bank to prevent reinforcements from supporting the initial assault waves. The timing had to be perfect. Opening fire too early would allow Japanese forces to disperse and seek cover. Waiting too long risked being overrun before the defensive fires could achieve their intended effect. Company G, positioned as the immediate counterattack force, represented the final element in Harrison's defensive equation. If Japanese forces managed to breach the main line despite the concentrated fires, Company G would launch immediate counterattacks to restore the position before the enemy could consolidate their gains. This required the reserve company to remain in covered positions, ready to move on short notice, while trusting that the primary defensive positions would channel any breakthrough into predictable avenues where counterattacks could be most effective. The engineering aspects of the defensive plan extended beyond weapon placement to include ammunition management and resupply procedures. Each machine gun position had been stockpiled with sufficient ammunition to sustain prolonged engagement, but crews had been instructed to fire in controlled bursts rather than continuous streams. The water-cooled barrels could handle extended firing, but ammunition conservation remained critical. Artillery crews had pre-positioned additional rounds at their gun positions with predetermined firing programs that allocated specific numbers of rounds to each pre-registered concentration. The 37mm guns carried limited canister ammunition, making target selection and timing absolutely crucial. As darkness fell on August 20th, the Marines settling into their positions along Alligator Creek understood they were about to test a defensive concept that challenged fundamental assumptions about Marine Corps tactics. The success of Harrison's plan depended not on individual heroics or aggressive maneuver, but on collective discipline and mathematical precision. Each Marine had to trust that his role in the larger geometric pattern would contribute to a defensive system designed to transform close-range combat into a calculated equation. The psychological pressure was enormous, but the engineering was flawless. Mathematics was about to meet warfare at 20 yards. At 3:10 a.m. on August 21st, the sound of splashing water carried across the narrow sand spit as approximately 200 Japanese soldiers began their assault across the mouth of Alligator Creek. Private First Class Bennett pressed his eye to the rear sight of his M19117A1 Browning, watching dark figures emerge from the jungle and began moving across the moonlit beach. The water-cooled machine gun was loaded and ready, its traverse and elevation mechanisms set to cover the predetermined sector of fire. Every instinct screamed at him to open fire immediately to cut down the advancing enemy while they were silhouetted against the pale sand and dark water. But Bennett held his fire, following the discipline that Lieutenant Colonel Morgan had drilled into every Marine along the defensive line. The Japanese soldiers moved with the confidence of troops who believed they were executing a successful surprise attack. Their voices carried across the narrow stretch of water as officers whispered orders and enlisted men struggled to maintain formation while crossing the uneven bottom of the creek mouth. Some stumbled in the deeper channels, their equipment clattering as they regained their footing. Others moved more smoothly, clearly veterans of previous night operations in China, where similar tactics had consistently overwhelmed Chinese defensive positions. The advancing Japanese force had no idea they were walking into a precisely calibrated killing zone. Each step brought them closer to the mathematical center of the Marines' defensive scheme, where overlapping fields of fire would converge with maximum effect. 25 yards from the western bank, 20 yard, 15 yard. The lead elements of the Japanese assault force were now close enough for individual Marines to distinguish faces in the moonlight. Close enough to hear the breathing of men who believed they were about to overrun another American position through superior spirit and night fighting techniques. At 10 yards, Lieutenant Colonel Morgan gave the order that would test months of preparation and planning. Fire. The word carried along the defensive line in a controlled shout that triggered the most concentrated burst of firepower the Marine Corps had ever delivered at such close range. The 37mm M3 guns opened first, their canister rounds exploding across the narrow sand spit like enormous shotgun blasts. Each M2 canister shell released 122 steel balls in an expanding cone of destruction that swept across the width of the crossing point, cutting down multiple attackers simultaneously. The effect was immediate and devastating. Japanese soldiers who had been advancing in formation were suddenly scattered across the sand, their assault momentum shattered by the precisely timed canister fire. But the Marine defensive plan was only beginning to unfold. As soon as the 37mm guns had expended their initial rounds, the M197A1 machine guns opened with interlocking fires that covered every square yard of the killing zone. Bennett pressed his trigger and felt the familiar vibration of the water-cooled weapon cycling at its sustained rate of 450 rounds per minute. The gun's traverse mechanism, allowing him to sweep his assigned sector while neighboring crews covered the gaps. The Japanese assault, which had begun with the disciplined confidence of elite infantry executing a proven tactic, dissolved into chaos as the mathematical precision of the American defensive fires took effect. Soldiers who had survived the initial canister rounds found themselves caught in overlapping machine gun fires that offered no dead space, no covered approaches, no escape routes back to the eastern bank. The geometric perfection of Harrison's defensive plan was revealing itself in the most brutal terms possible. Yet even this concentrated firepower could not stop every attacking soldier. Some Japanese troops, driven by training and desperation, continued advancing through the defensive fires and reached the western bank of Alligator Creek. A few managed to overrun individual Marine fighting positions, their bayonets and grenades creating small breaches in the defensive line. For a moment, the mathematical perfection of the defensive scheme seemed threatened by the unpredictable variables of individual courage and random survival. This was precisely the contingency that Harrison and Morgan had anticipated. Company G, held in reserve behind the main defensive line, received orders to counterattack immediately. The reserve Marines moved with practiced efficiency, their advance covered by continued machine gun fires that prevented Japanese forces from consolidating their small gains. The counterattack was swift and decisive, clearing the few Japanese soldiers who had reached the western bank before they could establish any meaningful foothold or signal their success to reinforcements waiting on the eastern side of the creek. The mathematics of defensive warfare were proving themselves in real time, But the night's action was far from over. As Company G restored the integrity of the main defensive line, Japanese mortars and 70mm infantry guns on the eastern bank began pounding the Marine positions with indirect fires. The enemy commanders, realizing that their initial assault had failed catastrophically, were attempting to suppress the American defensive fires long enough to organize a second attack. Mortar rounds crashed among the Marine fighting positions, their explosions illuminating the battlefield in brief hellish flashes that revealed the extent of Japanese casualties scattered across the sand spit. The incoming indirect fire tested the nerve of individual Marines who had to maintain their positions while mortar fragments whistled overhead and 70mm shells impacted along their defensive line. Bennett hunched over his machine gun, continuing to scan his sector for signs of renewed assault while trying to ignore the explosions that seemed to walk closer to his position with each salvo. The water jacket of his M1917A1 had grown hot from sustained firing, but the cooling system was functioning perfectly, allowing him to maintain accurate fires without the barrel overheating problems that plagued air-cooled weapons. The first phase of the Battle of Alligator Creek had demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of Harrison's defensive engineering, but both sides understood that the night's fighting was not yet concluded. Japanese forces still controlled the eastern bank of the creek, and their indirect fires indicated preparations for additional assault attempts. The Marines had proven their defensive concept worked at close range, but the ultimate test of mathematical warfare versus traditional offensive tactics was still to come. The second Japanese assault began with the methodical precision of commanders who believed they had learned from their initial failure. Another company-sized force, approximately 150 men, approached the same narrow sandpit where their comrades had been slaughtered less than an hour earlier. But rather than acknowledging the fundamental flaws in their tactical approach, the Japanese officers had concluded that insufficient numbers and coordination had caused their defeat. They moved with renewed determination, convinced that a larger force advancing in better formation would overwhelm the American defensive positions through sheer weight of attack. Private First Class Bennett watched the new assault develop through his machine gun sight, noting how the advancing Japanese soldiers stepped carefully around the bodies of their fallen comrades scattered across the sand. The enemy formation looked more disciplined than the first wave, with officers maintaining better control and soldiers advancing in more coherent lines. But from his position behind the M1917A1, Bennett understood what the attacking Japanese could not. They were walking into a killing zone that had been refined and perfected by the previous engagement. The 37mm gun crews had reloaded their weapons with fresh canister rounds. Artillery observers had confirmed their pre-registered concentrations remained accurate. Machine gun crews had adjusted their aiming stakes based on lessons learned from the first assault. When the second wave reached the same mathematical center point that had triggered the previous slaughter, Lieutenant Colonel Morgan again gave the order to fire. But this time, the defensive fires achieved even more devastating results. The 37mm canister rounds precisely aimed at the densest part of the enemy formation created interlocking cones of destruction that swept the entire width of the sand spit. The Japanese soldiers who had advanced with such careful formation discipline were cut down en masse by steel balls that maintained lethal velocity at the short range. Those who survived the canister fire found themselves immediately engaged by machine guns, whose crews had spent the interval between attacks refining their target acquisition and fire distribution techniques. The mathematical precision of Harrison's defensive concept was revealing its most brutal characteristic. Each engagement made the system more effective. The Marine gunners were learning to coordinate their fires with increasing efficiency, eliminating the small gaps in timing. Delays that had allowed a few Japanese soldiers to reach the western bank during the first assault. The kill zone was becoming more perfectly calibrated with each test, transforming from theoretical engineering into a practiced execution of defensive warfare that left no room for individual heroics or tactical improvisation to overcome. As dawn approached, Japanese commanders made a desperate attempt to salvage their offensive by implementing a flanking maneuver that demonstrated both tactical imagination and profound misunderstanding of their situation. Instead of continuing to assault the heavily defended sand spit crossing, They ordered troops to move north along the beach and attempt to wade around the Marine left flank through the surf beyond the breakers. The concept showed sophisticated tactical thinking. By moving through chested water, the attacking force would bypass the concentrated defensive fires that had proven so lethal at the creek mouth. But the Japanese flanking attempt only demonstrated how completely Harrison's defensive planning had anticipated every possible avenue of approach. The Marines positioned on the northern end of their defensive line had clear observation and fields of fire extending well into the surf zone. Japanese soldiers struggling through chest-deep water, their weapons held above their heads to keep them dry, presented perfect targets for machine gunners who could engage them at ranges where the M197A1S achieved maximum accuracy. The attacking troops moved slowly through the surf, unable to take cover or return effective fire while maintaining their balance against the ocean swells. Artillery concentrations that had been pre-registered for exactly this contingency began falling among the Japanese troops at 400 hours and again at 5:15. The explosive shells creating geysers of water and sand that added to the chaos of men already struggling to maintain formation in the surf. Machine gun fires from multiple positions converged on the exposed flanking force, cutting down soldiers who had no protection except the water that slowed their movement and made them easier targets. The flanking attempt, which might have succeeded against a conventionally deployed defensive line, became another mathematical demonstration of how geometric precision could neutralize tactical innovation. As full daylight arrived, Major General Harrison ordered the final phase of his defensive plan to commence. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Patterson began moving upstream to cross Alligator Creek at a dry ford approximately 3,000 yards inland from the coastal fighting. This maneuver represented the culmination of Harrison's engineering approach to warfare. Having used defensive fires to fix and destroy the enemy assault forces, he was now deploying a mobile element to collapse the entire Japanese position through envelopment. Patterson's battalion crossed the upper creek without opposition and began sweeping down the eastern bank. Their advance coordinated with artillery fires that prevented Japanese forces from establishing new defensive positions or organizing an orderly withdrawal. The enveloping force moved with methodical precision, their advance covered by the same pre-registered artillery concentrations that had supported the defensive phase of the battle. At approximately 3,000 yards inland, the Marines pivoted toward the beach, trapping the surviving Japanese forces in a collapsing pocket with no escape routes except the same killing zone that had already proven lethal. The arrival of Marine tanks crossing the sandbar in daylight marked the final integration of Harrison's combined arms approach. The armor, which had been held in reserve during the night, fighting to avoid fratricidal incidents in darkness, now moved across the contested ground to provide direct fire support for the infantry advance. One tank was lost to Japanese mines, but the surviving armor added mobile firepower that could engage targets of opportunity and support the systematic clearing of enemy positions. At 127 hours, Marine Fighter Squadron 223, which had arrived at Henderson Field on August 20th, made their first interception and began strafing runs that sealed the remaining escape routes along the beach. The integration of air support with the ground tactical plan demonstrated how Harrison's defensive engineering had seamlessly transitioned into offensive operations using the same mathematical precision that had characterized the night's defensive success. By 1700 hours, organized Japanese resistance had ceased, and the mathematical revolution in American defensive doctrine had achieved complete tactical validation. When the smoke cleared on the morning of August 22nd, the mathematical precision of Harrison's defensive engineering could be measured in stark numerical terms that would reshape American tactical doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. Between 774 and 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead across the narrow sand spit and surrounding beach areas, their bodies scattered in patterns that revealed the geometric perfection of interlocking machine gun fires and canister rounds. Only 15 members of Colonel Yamada's assault force had been captured alive, most of them wounded men who had been unable to continue fighting. Against these losses, American casualties numbered between 34 and 44 killed in action, with approximately 75 wounded. The exchange ratio at the sand spit itself approached 20 Japanese deaths for every American killed, a mathematical vindication of defensive engineering that exceeded even Harrison's most optimistic projections. The fate of Colonel Yamada himself became emblematic of the collision between traditional Japanese offensive doctrine and American defensive innovation. Multiple accounts reported that the regimental commander committed suicide after witnessing the complete destruction of his assault force, though some historical sources suggested ambiguity in the exact circumstances of his death. What remained undisputed was that an elite Japanese officer who had commanded successful operations across Asia had been unable to adapt his tactical thinking to overcome a defensive system based on mathematical principles rather than traditional military heroics. The psychological impact of this defeat would resonate through Japanese command structures, challenging fundamental assumptions about American fighting capability and defensive resolve. Private First Class Bennett, examining his M19117A1 machine gun in the aftermath of the battle, found the weapon's water-cooled barrel still warm from the sustained firing that had characterized the night's engagement. The mathematical precision of the defensive fires had been validated not just in casualty statistics, but in the mechanical performance of weapon systems that had functioned exactly as their engineering specifications predicted. The water cooling system had prevented barrel overheating despite prolonged engagement at cyclic rates that would have caused air-cooled weapons to malfunction. The pre-registered artillery concentrations had impacted within yards of their intended targets throughout the night, demonstrating that mathematical fire control could achieve accuracy that individual gunners could never match through visual observation alone. The tactical implications of the Battle of Alligator Creek extended far beyond a single night's fighting. Major General Harrison had proven that modern warfare rewarded systematic engineering over individual courage, that defensive positions designed with mathematical precision could achieve results that traditional military thinking deemed impossible. The concept of allowing enemy forces to approach within grenade range before opening fire contradicted every manual and training program in the Marine Corps. Yet, it had produced the most decisive tactical victory American forces had achieved since entering the Pacific War. 3 weeks later, the template established at Alligator Creek would face its ultimate test when approximately 3,000 Japanese troops under Major General Hiroshi Tanaka launched a coordinated assault against Marine positions on what would become known as Edson's Ridge. The battle fought between September 12th and 14th would apply Harrison's defensive engineering principles on a much larger scale. Prepared positions, pre-registered artillery fires, interlocking machine gun coverage, and disciplined fire control would again prove decisive against Japanese night attack tactics. Tanaka's assault elements would suffer between 700 and 800 killed in action, while inflicting approximately 100 American deaths, depending on which historical sources were consulted. The mathematical relationship between defensive engineering and tactical success would hold constant even as the scale of combat increased dramatically. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Morgan, walking the battlefield where his battalion had executed Harrison's revolutionary defensive concept, understood that they had participated in something larger than a single tactical engagement. The precision with which overlapping fields of fire had functioned, the effectiveness of pre-registered artillery concentrations, and the devastating impact of canister rounds at close range had demonstrated that warfare could be reduced to mathematical equations when commanders possessed sufficient discipline to implement systematic engineering principles. The psychological challenge of allowing armed enemy soldiers to approach within yards of defensive positions had been overcome through training and trust in geometric precision rather than individual heroics. The broader strategic implications of the battle would influence American defensive doctrine throughout the Pacific theater. Island garrisons from Tarawa to Ioima would apply lessons learned at Alligator Creek using mathematical fire planning and geometric positioning to achieve tactical results the traditional defensive thinking could never have accomplished. The concept of trading space for mathematical certainty, allowing enemy forces to enter predetermined killing zones where defensive fires could achieve maximum effectiveness, would become standard procedure for American forces facing Japanese assault tactics. Samuel Kona, the Solomon Islander, whose intelligence had enabled the Marines to prepare their defensive trap with such precision, represented the human element that had made mathematical warfare possible. His capture and torture by Japanese forces, followed by his escape and warning to American commanders, had provided the tactical intelligence necessary to implement Harrison's defensive engineering at exactly the right time and place. Without Kona's information about Japanese troop strength and intended routes of approach, the geometric perfection of the Marine defensive plan might have been wasted on an empty battlefield. The final lesson of Alligator Creek was perhaps the most profound. They had won because they turned a night attack into a numbers problem and solved it at 20 yards. Traditional military wisdom emphasized meeting enemy forces as far forward as possible, engaging targets at maximum effective range, preventing the enemy from closing to decisive combat distances. Harrison's revolutionary approach had deliberately violated every principle of conventional defensive doctrine, using mathematical precision to transform close-range combat from a test of individual courage into a calculated equation where geometric positioning and coordinated fires guaranteed tactical success.